Hi, this is Dan Halsey. Welcome to the design process and welcome to digital design with Adobe Illustrator. This is going to be a great class, going to be intense. We're going to have a lot of fun and learn many new skills in design. In the same time, we're going to go through the design process and all the functions and features of that in order for us to do good work. Look forward to your comments and working with you on your designs in the next coming days and weeks. Know that this information will be online for you going forward, and you can also contact me at any time, and that this advanced design and digital design program, the whole idea is that as we all learn how to do this software, Adobe Illustrator, and this design process, if you're working in CAD or whatever software you're working in, that we can develop a common language and we can work together more and more on our designs. This is the design process sheet. This is the sheet that we developed some years ago when, after doing a number of designs, really needing to get organized, needing to find a way to document what we're doing so that we can get all these steps. And at one point it was one page. Now you can see it's over two because we're just adding features, adding options, especially like you see for aerial images, things like that. There are a lot of different places now where we can get some of this information. So this makes it easier to just kind of keep putting that information on these documents for us. And then after I had my survey done, I was going to the county and looking for topographic information and other information. And unfortunately in this county, they didn't have anything online. And so what you're seeing here is a scan of 11 by 17 printout that they did on their laser printer that they sent to me in the mail, if you can imagine that. $25, gave them my address, asked them, well, put what you can on this, please. And then off of their computer, they sent me this, and then I had to scan it in. But not too bad, because I had on here topography, which is great. I can assume that it's correct from the county. I have a very good aerial. You can see all the detail on here, where the houses and the sheds and different things are. You can also look at the land. And on the land you can see wetlands in the lower left and the upper right, where the grasses are. You can see a small pond, basically seasonal, or it's a permanent pond in that area, depending upon the weather and the climate. And other green areas that are probably flooding in the spring. So a lot of information you can gather from this aerial picture from the patterns. I also can see where the power lines were on the right side there. There was also a forest and other information that they had on here. So I'm starting to develop the patterns of understanding on this property when they sent me this map. So this is the second layer of my map. And then I started to put the labels on it in Illustrator, did the road, did the house. So each time I have a layer, I start adding more information on my design. And again, we'll work with those layers, turning them on and off as we do our concepts, our functional spaces, and our final design work. So then I went on the Soil Web Survey. The Soil Web Survey of the USDA helps identify soil conditions and types. The lines are generalized in position. So when you see a hard line between two different soils, most of the time that line, of course, doesn't exist. It's a transition area. And sometimes they can even move. But it creates a mosaic of patterns used in defining water movement and the areas where the plants can be. So each one of those different colors is basically either a different soil or a different slope in the same soil. So we have a 504B, there's also a 504A or 504G or something like that, or C, and that's basically telling you the slope of a 504 soil. So going on the Soil Web Survey, I'm finding out what these different soils are, and I'm creating a soil map. And now I can use those soils, understanding the different reports that I get from that, to help me do my plant selection, and then also understand the slope in those areas, and other things too, because we use the Soil Web Survey a lot. It's actually called the Web Soil Survey, and you can Google that, and we'll go there and check that out also. So there's my soil map, the different soil types I have, and some slopes. Now in this slide, I'm actually walking on the property and noticing where the water flow is, right? That's what all the blue lines are. That's me walking on the property, making notes on my little printout in my notebook and saying, okay, so I know this is the topography, but what direction is this water flowing? And as you can see, it actually is following perpendicular to most of the contour lines. It's flowing just where you think it might flow on that. And that's important to us because if we're going to do any kind of water collection, if we're going to do keyline plowing or swales or any kind of subsoiling, we want to, of course, collect that water as it's moving across the landscape. So in this case, I have my aerial picture and I'm just walking the land and I'm making notes in my notebook, and then I bring them here to remind me which way the water is actually moving as we have a rainfall or even the spring snow melt in this case, where that water is going to go. In the lower right, you can also see the legend or the key, sometimes we call it that, and those different colors are depicting the different types of uses. Now there are no swales, paths, or zones on here, so in this case that legend isn't quite used yet, but we still want to have all those map components on our design because that's what makes it a map, and that's what speaks the language of our stakeholders and the people that we're working with. Then the second part on here, walking the land, is deciding how to divide up the property. Now even with 10 acres, there's going to be different microclimates, different conditions. And so in this case, I actually have divided the property in 4 different biomes, we'll call them, for solutions and for strategizing. So the far left is a wetland area. It's actually quite wet, saturated soils, and there is some field in that area on the left, and then it bumps up into the house in the residential space. But I'm calling that basically the wetland section. And there's a crop and orchard space in there. And then the residential section, section number 2. That's where the buildings are, the sheds, utilities, and then also their garden spaces. So those garden spaces are within that area, and that's basically your zone 1 in permaculture. And the third section going to the right is the old field, the old corn and bean field, pretty beat up, not a lot of organic material there, pretty sandy, and so we're calling that the prairie section because that is going to be ultimately the restoration project will be turn it back into a usable prairie for harvesting prairie plants and foraging. And then the last section butts up against a forest. So on the far right, the far east of this property is an old oak forest that's still there, and then those red lines are actually high tension power lines. They're very high, but they are something that we have to consider because we have to plant under those. So we have our power lines there and we have the forest, and so I'm calling that the forest edge, and that's section 4. There's a lot of energy, a lot of moisture, a lot of resources coming out of that woodland that will affect the soils and the fertility of that area. So those are 4 different sections. It makes it a little easier when you can break up the property based on its ecological condition, the site conditions. Helps you moving forward what you might do in making your strategy. Now, I'm starting to draw some of the things in the residential area. I put all the gardens in that they had, some trees, the greenhouse, the driveway, the house, the little dirt road that they had, and the shed. These basically are things in that zone 1, working with them, and that those garden spaces, by the way, those are pretty much up for grabs, whatever they're doing with that. Although I did notice that there was some flooding going on. As you see, it kind of goes into that wet area in the center there. That's a little marshy in the springtime and gets pretty wet, so that might be affecting what we actually do in those annual beds for growing. So we're adding the features. We put in the tree line over by the road. We actually put in the field there on the left in that right above the wetland, and we're starting to add the components to help us build our base map more and more. Then we start deciding what the zones are. And these are flexible. They're probably going to change and move, but really, again, we had our patterns on here. We have our biomes on here, and certain zones are going to be naturally fitting in certain areas as far as access, distance from the house, things like that. So zone 1, of course, right around the house, right in that central area, the residential section 2. But then we have zone 2 on different parts of the property based upon soil types and what we can grow there. And zone 2 is orchard. orchard space, orchard trees. Zone 3 are field crops. So we're growing field crops already in much of this area. So what we're trying to transition away from the field crops to the prairie and the woodland spaces. So over on the right side where we have our prairie section, we basically have a 2-3 and a 3-4. Transitioning those areas from orchard space, and would be used for that, but then moving it on to woodland space and managed crops areas and things, depending upon what our final design is. We also can see there's some zone 5s in here, and those are areas that we're not touching, especially like in the wetland. Probably very fragile in there. We don't want to get in and start messing that up. The fact that we're working all around these wetlands in itself is going to affect them. So we're going to want to be very careful doing that. So we have our base map here, we have our topography, we have our soil map, and now we have a good breakdown of what the zones will be, and then within those zones we can start deciding what the features are that we're going to work with. So we started off with the zones, and then we started bringing access paths here. And now you see that the swales are in, and some paths are in. And in this case, that big field off to the right, this is very sandy soil, really sandy space. So those big blue lines are about 20 feet across. They're like basins. The only time we're going to have water moving across this field, most likely, is in the springtime when the snow melts. When the ground is frozen, then the water moves across the surface. But it's so sandy, the infiltration is so fast during the summer, we're probably not going to get any water going in those swales. But in the springtime, they're going to be full because the ground is going to be frozen, and they're just going to keep filling up with water. It'll probably freeze at night, and they might be solid ice at some time in late winter. But in the springtime, they are going to melt, and all that water will be focused then into the center and raise the water table underneath those areas, keeping that soil much more moist, and gives us opportunity to plant things now because the water isn't all just disappearing deep into the soils. We can concentrate into areas and use that to hydrate the soil, build our organic material, and bring in more plants. On the far left, you see a little tiny blue swale just as the water is coming into that wetland, and that's a good idea just for basically collecting the water and cleaning it. There's enough probably flying into that wetland from the ditch along the road. So any water that's coming into this wetland needs to go through some sort of biofilter. A swale is great for that, so the water infiltrates to the ground and doesn't go on top of the ground or cause erosion. We also have a brown path going through that. Access is very important. And by the way, those blue swales, as we'll see, are actually also our access points for the tractor to get into the field. So we have our paths here, we have access, we have a few swales on here for collecting water in the springtime and also use those for access. And now we can start putting in our plants. So this is what the final design looks like. And of course there's a lot of different features going on here, but I want to show you the title block. I want to mention to you also that back in this time we were only doing a title block with that, say this is 1 inch equals 50 feet. All those plants are at 1 to 50. This was the only design scale that we used, and then we would change the scale for every project. That's why we've gone to the 1 to 20. Now all of our work is 1 to 20. 1 inch equals 20 feet. And then we place that artwork and rescale it onto this title block. And we'll be doing that over and over. It makes life so simple, and it helps us also create assets that are all in a common scale to use later. You'll also see pullouts on here, lots of lists listing the grasses, native prairie grasses in the bottom there of the design, oak savanna plants, other prairie plants, wet prairie plants, and then on the lower left you'll see other polycultures that we're using there in our orchard spaces. There's a berry polyculture, one for cherries and one for apple. Those are great to have on the side of the design because you can see they're pretty tiny in our design. So we're actually using callouts or pullouts on the design itself and the title block to show what these things actually are that are too small to show. We do that a lot in the designs, calling out a lot of different things, and when we're doing our artwork, we can actually create a little frame around it in our artwork file so that when we work on our title block file, we can actually take just that section of the artwork. Just that piece of the design will show up, and that saves a lot of memory space and file size in doing that. So we have our lists up here. You can see we have divided spaces on here. All of the trees and the plants are in. Those correspond to a plant list that would appear in the center here. And then there's lots of notations around here. Now, you can see 1 to 50 is pretty high for a scale here. And you can see that also that these 10 acres doesn't really fill the space. But each one of those grids is an inch across. So what's nice about that is that 1 to 50 is a pretty easy way to measure each one of those grids and generally start to get things placed. It was 1 to 40. It probably was too big for the paper. That would bring it up about 20%, and it would be too big to print out on the 24 by 36 paper. Also back in these days, we were basically working at 24 by 36 or the A1 size. We hadn't gotten to the fact that we could already just make it any size we want and rescale it for the title block. So this is the initial design, and you can see the little aerial is in the background. Our topography is on there. And so we've got all the pieces and all the layers that we've been working on, and then all the plants now on here. And these plants, as you'll notice, are all numbered. And that will go to the plant list. This is an example of the design now where we took out the background, took out the topography, just to show the pattern of where the plants are. You can see all those to the far right. There's those bands of shrubs. That whole upper right corner turned out to be a huge sand dune, just from erosion. All the organic material is gone. It was a big dry sand dune, so we put a crosswind as small windbreaks, rows and rows of shrubs to collect organic material and help also hold the soil so we can develop the plants in that area also and keep the water and keep it from drying out so much, keep the sand from blowing away. Those will catch a lot of organic material, especially in the fall when the leaves are blowing, and we'll start to regenerate that soil and get nutrients down into the sand there. Now, just because it's sand doesn't mean we don't have a lot of other choices. There are a lot of plants now that we could put in that sand that we probably couldn't grow in other parts of the property. And a lot of the other plants in the other parts of the property, they're not going to do well in that sand. So having a sand dune is nice diversity. It gives us another microclimate of a totally different soil to work with and a lot of different other opportunities. So you can see on here now, the same components are on, but when you take out that aerial, it's a little bit easier to see what our strategies are and how we're working in this design. Here's a little close-up of the upper left corner. See all the little polycultures in there? Those are the call-outs that we have. The green dots on the left, that's the windbreak of existing trees. Now existing trees have a plus sign in them, and new trees have a dot in the center. So that's the difference. These trees on the left should have little plus signs or crosses in them to signify that they are existing trees. And then you could even put next to them, what kind of trees they are. And then the new trees that are numbered and the shrubs in here, they actually have little dots in the center. And when you're placing plants and you're putting flags out or where they're going to be planted, that dot is actually where you would put the flag, where then the tree would go also. So this is our zone 3 and our zone 2, and a little bit of zone 5 on the bottom. We also have the drain field showing there. That's the water and the effluents coming from the house and where the drain field is. And of course, drain fields for the septic systems, we don't want to touch those. Very expensive. We don't want to damage them. Planting around them is great. Some of the trees will get nutrients from that, but it really depends on what kind of field it is. A lot of people have mound systems, and we don't want to ruin anybody's septic system, of course, and it's a big liability. So we don't plant on those. Maybe some grasses, some perennials and things like that, but we pretty much want to stay off of there. We also have to remember that in northern climates we have a salt, ice, and snow zone. That means 5 feet on either side of any path or any road where you're going to have cars going. That's where the snow will be plowed. It will turn to ice, and there might also be salt on the road that will be plowed and pushed over to the side of the road also. So that area needs to be treated different, especially in urban centers and along county roads. A lot of salt buildup, and that salt and those minerals build up in the soil along those roads. And so you probably want to look at salt-tolerant plants, but also plants that don't mind being pummeled by 2 or 3 feet of snow that's going to turn into ice. Maybe more like perennials or really staunch and short shrubs. But that area gets beat up a lot in the snow, and especially just imagine how it gets pounded with snow when the snow plow comes by, but also when it rains and you have ice freezing. So there's a blue side to each one of those, each side of that road, to show that's the snow, ice, and salt zone. When we do our designs, we actually have a snow, ice, and salt zone on the front of our properties if there's any road in northern climates, to remind us that that needs to be a plant that can tolerate those kind of conditions. Here's our eastern side and the prairie side, and now you can see all the different trees in here, the swales, and then I have a brown line running through the swale because that's the access onto the field to do the work. And also around the ponding, this pond now is going to get water more and more because the water is more slowly going to be trickling into this pond and not drain away. So we have wet prairie plants right around the pond and dry prairie plants above that. And you'll see plant lists also for this design on different sides of this. I think they're kind of cut off in the top. At least in the bottom here, native prairie grasses, soil builders, big blue stem, cowpea, false indigo, perennial pea, the sweet pea, prairie turnip, prairie sage, filling that area. Now when we put those plants in, of course, there'll probably be a lot of other native plants that'll show up. There also might need to be some weeding. And of course, when you're restoring any kind of grassland or prairie, there also need to be some kind of burn every other year to get rid of the invasives and actually help the prairie heal. Fire is very positive effect on that because fire is a natural regime in prairies. And the plants that, as the flash fire goes through, it helps the regular and the native prairie plants flourish, and the invasive basically disappear after a while. So you can see all along the edges here are all the plants, and in the middle of the field, not a lot happening there until we kind of edge into that space more and more. We're using the soils on the edge of the property because it's been the least disturbed, especially on the fence line. Our best soils are going to be within 3 or 4 feet of the fence line because it doesn't get plowed as much, and you have lots of organic material caught there in the wind, and you also have the birds that have basically been dropping manure there for maybe even decades. So that soil's pretty good soil to start with. So that's a little explanation of how we work with layers and kind of a fast track. These are all the things that we're going to learn during the class. As you look at these designs, what you're seeing are lines and shapes. We use squares for buildings, lines for roads, and it's just a different thickness of the line, different color to the line, and those characteristics that give us the detail. And then you can see how they're layered over each other, and even the 217 tree at the top there, how transparent they are, because we want to be able to see through. So we use transparency on these solid shapes so that we can see that the plants are actually underneath them and which ones are on top. And then you're going to notice too that my color palette has changed a lot since 2009. In a little over 10 years, very much refined our process in doing the design. We don't even use numbers anymore. We use the initials of the scientific names for plants. It helps us learn them more and more, especially the more that we use them. So thanks for joining me on this presentation about the layers and during our design process. You will have now that design process sheet, and the next thing we're going to do is start our design process by going through that data table. So familiarize yourself with the data table, the 8 pages in that Word document, and start looking at those websites and how the table works, and we'll be going through that next. Thank you, and talk to you soon. I hope you have questions and comments to help us with the class. You inform me, and then I can inform you. Thank you.